phrase that I've heard a lot is there's a monkey on your back. That there's just some trouble or some problem that you feel like it's there, and you don't. Sometimes there's a way to get it off, but a lot of times there's just nothing you can do about it. There's a health problem or something going on that you can't get rid of, some kind of monkey on your back. And whenever I think about that idea of being a monkey on your back, I think about the Bible word persevere. When you think about the Bible word persevere, that's literally two different words kind of pushed together in the original language. That means, so if you'll turn for a moment to Romans chapter 8 and verse 25. Romans chapter 8 and in verse 25, Paul writes about perseverance. And he says in Romans 8:25, if we hope for what we do not see, we eagerly wait for it with perseverance. And so that he talks in Romans 8 about all the troubles that we might face, but he says if we keep our eyes on that prize and just dwell under it, I'm going to accept that this is my home for the moment. This is something I'm just going to have to deal with for a while, that if we'll stay faithful, God is going to lift that off when the time is right. And that 37 and 38, the first two chapters, Genesis 37 and 38, they really look at a couple of troubles that Judah brings on people. Judah being Joseph's older brother, he's the fourth-born son of Jacob, and of course he's the line that David will eventually come from, that Jesus will eventually come from. Well, in Genesis 37 and 38, Judah puts some monkeys on people's back, and there's a lot of trouble that comes from that. It starts in Genesis 37 with showing us the troubles that Joseph had with his brothers. He was his father's favorite son, right? Already, that's going to cause him some problems with his siblings, with the beautiful coat that his father gave him. But then he also has these dreams. Dreams, he tells his brothers, where he sees sheaves bowing down to him, and they're like, what, you think that you're going to be in charge of us someday? And then even dreams where he sees the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down to him, and even his father says, you think that I'm going to be bowing down to you someday? And so we're told that there's a lot of jealousy and envy because Joseph shared these dreams with him. And so his brothers all go one day and they take the sheep out to graze. And it's been a while since they've been gone. And so his father says, why don't you go check on them? Make sure that they're okay. Come back and tell me. And so Joseph goes. And while they still see Joseph coming from a long way off, they start to get an idea. They say, let's get rid of this dreamer. And in the Hebrew, it literally says this master of dreams. Now, it's kind of funny to think of Joseph as a master of dreams, because later on, he's going to be interpreting dreams. But they don't mean it that way. They mean it in kind of they're making fun of him way. This guy who thinks he's going to rule over us. He has these great, important dreams. And so they decide, let's just kill him. We're tired of him. Let's get rid of him. Now, the oldest brother, Reuben, he says, I don't feel like that's good. He feels responsible. He's got to go back and tell his dad what happens. And so he says, let's just put him in this pit for now, and we'll figure it out. And while Reuben is figuring it out, they see some Ishmaelites coming down the road. Remember, Ishmaelites are like distant cousins. Abraham had Ishmael and Isaac. Well, Joseph comes from Isaac. The Ishmaelites come from Ishmael. They're like distant cousins. And so they say, there's our distant cousins. We'll just sell them into slavery. And it's Judah. It's Judah who has this idea. He says, we can profit from this. We can make just a little extra money. Why kill him? We can make some money. And so they sell his brother into slavery, and they send them on down the line. Judah has put a monkey on Joseph's back. Now, that continues in chapter 38. In chapter 38, we continue the story of Judah. And do you ever think it's weird, right in the middle of Joseph's story, there's this kind of random jump over. We're going to look at Judah and Tamar. But really, it's kind of a continuation of Judah's problems. And so Judah has sons of his own, and his oldest son, he marries a woman named Tamar. And we're told that was a really wicked person, and so before he and Tamar are able to have children, dies. And so then what they thought of was right. The custom at the time was if a woman didn't have any children, she married his younger brother so that she could have children who would provide for her when she got old. And so she marries the younger brother. And we're told that he treats her the wrong way, and so then he dies. And so, you see, Tamar, really, she's in a bad situation. It's not her fault. Probably her father arranged the marriage in the first place. It's not her fault that she has all these troubles, but she keeps filtering through these evil, wicked men who keep dying before she can have a child. And then Judah has a third son, but we're told that he's too young to get married yet. And so Judah says, just wait. And when my youngest son is old enough, you can marry him. And you'll be able to have the child that you need to support you in your old age. And so she waits. And that's what we're going to see through this with perseverance. A lot of times it's about waiting for things to work out right. She waits and she waits. But then, when the young man becomes old enough, I don't know if Judah just had forgotten or he didn't care anymore, but he doesn't marry her to the third son. And so this is the moment where Tamar stops waiting and she takes things into her own hand. She's tired of having this monkey on her back, and so she turns to sin to get it off of her back. And so she dresses herself up in a way that was recognizable to them of how some might have dressed. And she sits in this particular place in the road that was recognizable in their culture of what kind of people sat in that place in the road. And then when Judah came riding by one day, he saw her, and they participated in sin together. And she took some of his things. And so 3 months later, when it turns up that Judah's daughter-in-law is pregnant, he says, well, we'll kill her. She's done something wrong. And so then she sends back his things. And this is really the key about Judah. Because Judah, he does some really terrible things in these chapters. And he does not show himself to be a righteous person. But when someone confronts him and says, you have done the wrong thing, you have sinned, Judah repents. Judah says she's more righteous than I am. It says he never knew her again. But of course he allows her to live and to provide for her, to raise her children. David does lots of terrible things, but what makes David a man after God's own heart is that when he is confronted with his sins, he changes. He repents. He lets go of those and moves on to something better. And we can see Judah has that same quality. Now that's going to be important later in Genesis because Joseph is going to test Judah. He's going to try to figure out, are you the same guy? And she chose to use sin to get that problem off her back. And it worked. It did work. She has the children that she always wanted. But the story of her having children should be eerily similar to us and shows us that there are consequences that are going to follow with this, because Tamar ends up pregnant with twin boys. And when she begins to give birth, one of their hands appears first, and so they tie a little ribbon around it real fast. I bet it was a blue ribbon. What do you think? No, but they tie a little ribbon around it real fast, and so that they know who the firstborn son was, because that was important to them. And then the hand goes back, and the first baby to fully come out has no ribbon on his arm. And so they almost kind of scold the baby in verse 29 that, how did you break through? This breach be upon you. It was so important to them to know who the firstborn was. They said, you took your brother's place. Now we've seen this before. Jacob, the younger twin, who through deception and other means takes his brother's blessing, he takes his brother's birthright, he takes his older brother's place. And we don't have to know the rest of the story of this family. We know there's a lot of conflict that's going to be between these boys. There's a lot of conflict coming for this family. When we take things into our own hands, when we go to sin in order to get the monkeys off of our back, we are adding our own monkeys. We're adding our own consequences. Now, that's the example of Tamar. And so moving forward in chapter 39, we're going to see the example of Joseph. And just like Tamar, Joseph has some terrible circumstances caused by Judah and his brothers that are no fault of his own. Joseph has not done anything to warrant all of this treatment. Joseph isn't being punished for anything he's done wrong, but we're going to notice the way that Joseph handles it. So he's sold into slavery. They take him to Egypt. He's purchased by a man named Potiphar. And so there he is, a slave in somebody else's household. But we're told everything he touches is gold. If Joseph does it, it just works out exactly how it's supposed to. If he puts his hands on it, it does even better than anyone expected it to do. And so his master notices it and he says, I trust you. you're in charge. If you say it, they're going to do it. I'm the master of it. He says the only thing the master knew for sure that he owned was the bread that they handed him every day. He just didn't worry about it because he could trust Joseph. Now, we're also told that Joseph is a very attractive person and that Potiphar's wife had taken notice of this. And so every day she would ask him, come lie with me. Every day she would put that in front of him. And every day he said no. And one day she grabbed his cloak. It's always clothing that troubles Joseph, isn't it? He had the coat of many colors, the cloak that made him look guilty. But she grabs his cloak and he says to her, how can I do this thing and sin against, he doesn't say Potiphar or himself or even Potiphar's wife. How can I sin against God? Joseph has some terrible monkeys on his back. He is a slave in a foreign country, doesn't know if he'll ever see his family again. And sometimes when we have burdens in our life, sometimes when we are really struggling, the easiest thing to do is just to turn to sin to distract us. Just to find that sin that kind of helps us forget about all our problems for just a minute. And, Joseph could have done that here. He could have turned to Potiphar's wife to distract him from his troubles, but he says, I cannot sin against God. And so he flees. And we're told Potiphar is furious. He's angry about this. And so Joseph has gone from being a slave to being a slave who is in prison. More monkeys added to his back. But what happens to Joseph? Joseph just does what's right. And so everything he touches is gold. God blesses all the things that he does in prison. So that the head of the prison sees and he says, look, I trust you. I'm going to put you pretty much in charge of this place because everything that you do just works out. And that's really the interesting thing about Joseph's story is he is in some terror. I have never been sold into slavery, and I have never been in prison before. And I tell you what, I can't imagine how hard this would be. But Joseph is thriving. He is thriving. He is just doing, and it's all working out so good. And then something else bad will happen, and he doesn't give up. He is thriving in these terrible situations. Now, it seems like there is some kind of attempt on Pharaoh's life. Somebody tries to poison him or something like that to get rid of him, because suddenly we have these two new prisoners. We have the baker, he makes all of Pharaoh's food. And we have the butler, he's the cupbearer. He's the one who tastes Pharaoh's food before he gives it to Pharaoh to eat to see if he dies first so that the Pharaoh doesn't die. And so that's a great job, But that these two people end up in prison together, and it seems like they're trying to sort through who's the one that tried to get rid of Pharaoh, the butler or the baker. And so they have these dreams. And Joseph hears them talking about their dreams. And I think there's kind of a little clue here in chapter 40 about what is it that really made Joseph so special. He just looked for people in need and tried to find a way to help them. And he doesn't owe these men anything, but he hears them talking and he says, God can interpret dreams. And so the butler says, why not? Okay, here's what happened in my dream. And Joseph says, all right, God says that this is what your dream means. You are going to be lifted up, your head's going to be lifted up and restored back to where you come from, back to your position. And the butler's like, that's great. And so the baker says, well, that worked out pretty well for him. I'll give it a shot. Here's what my dream is about. And Joseph says, all right. And he wants to help people, but he's not going to sugarcoat the truth. He's just, the most helpful thing he can do is just be honest. He says, your head is going to be lifted up and taken off. And you're going to be guilty of this, and this is going to happen very shortly. And it happens exactly how Joseph predicted that it would, exactly how God told him that it would happen. And so you notice what Joseph asked the butler after he says, when you get out of here and everything is right in your life again, don't forget about me. Talk to me about Pharaoh, or talk to Pharaoh about me, and maybe I could talk to him. Maybe I could get out of this situation. If there is a way to get a burden off your back in a righteous manner, if there is a righteous way to remove trouble from your life, to get that monkey off your back, by all means, get it off your back in a righteous way. But Joseph is not going to sin to get those things off of his back. And so, of course, the butler completely forgets about Joseph. It says, for 2 years, he doesn't think about it again until Pharaoh has his own dreams, and he's disturbed by them. In the first dream, there's these 7 fat, happy cows. Where does that commercial say happy cows? I think it's California, and I don't understand that, but I'm teasing. But that's 7 fat, happy cows, and then there's these skinny. Pharaoh says he's never seen such ugly cows in all of Egypt. these skinny, gaunt, sickly cows, and the skinny ones eat the fat ones. And then he has another dream. There's these 7 heads of wheat, and they're lush, they're full. And then there's these 7 sickly heads of wheat. They're dying, and they're terrible. And so he wakes up and he says, "What did these? There's all these 7s and all these. What does it mean?" So he calls all his wise men, and finally the butler, who's always right there, ready. If Pharaoh wants to drink something, he's going to drink it first. So he's always right there. He says, "Oh yeah, I forgot about this guy when I was in prison." And so they call for Joseph. And Joseph says, "Now I can't explain the dream to you, but God is capable of doing that. And here's what it means. 7 years, you're going to have lots of crops, an overflow of crops. It's all going to go well. 7 years of famine. And so if I were you, Pharaoh, I'd find someone that you really trust, and I'd have them be setting aside crops for that 7 good years so that nobody has to starve in the 7 years of famine." And Pharaoh says, "I know just the man for the job." And it's kind of interesting when you think about the Egyptian religions and all the things that the Egyptians, priests and people claim they could do. Pharaoh says, "Who do we know that has the Spirit of God like this man?" All of the different gods and things that they worship in Egypt, and Pharaoh himself says, "I've never seen anyone who has access to a God like Joseph does." It was something different. It was something special. It was something authentic. And so he says, "You're the one that's going to be in charge of this project." And so just like that, it has been 2, 3, a few years since his brothers sold him into slavery and first put that monkey on his back. And then he was put into prison. He's endured false accusations. Things have been terrible. But just like that, God lifts all of those things off of Joseph's back. And now he is the leader of a country. Pharaoh says, "I'm the only one higher than you. You're in charge. If you say it, it happens." And so now he's able to, Joseph likes helping people. That's what he does all the time now. He's able to use his authority and his position to help people, to save them from the famine. Till Joseph is given a wife. And that through his wife, he has 2 sons. And notice, that's interesting because that's how many sons Tamar had. And notice what it says in chapter 41 and in verse 51. Chapter 41 and verse 51 says, "Joseph called the name of the firstborn son Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house." Right? So I feel like all the troubles of the past are resolved. Everything is worked out for me. Verse 52, the name of the second he called Ephraim, "For God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction." It was terrible, but God finally lifted those things off my back. And because he never turned to sin to deal with his troubles, we don't see any kind of residual consequences. There's nothing that Joseph is having to deal with now that he put on his own back, because he just trusted, when the time is right, God will lift this off of me. And so he was not going to add any more troubles than he already had to deal with. And they were big enough on their own, weren't they? And so we see Joseph, by just trusting that God was going to lift those off his back when the time was right, finds that God does exactly that. Now I want to, as we're closing, I want to notice a couple of verses. And that's thinking about Joseph, when he asked the butler to remember him. It's okay to ask for our troubles to pass away from us. And that's, notice, for example, 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 5. Don't you think that Joseph probably prayed to God often about his troubles being removed from him? That he probably asked God to get him out of slavery, or to get him out of prison, or whatever it might be. And it reminds me of 1 Timothy 5 and verse 5, when it's talking about the widow who has her own troubles, and says, 1 Timothy 5:5, "She who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day." And so it's describing a person who, she has nobody to take care of her. But it says she just trusts in God. And so she's just going to pray to God night and day about her circumstances. And so God puts her in a better situation. And that prayer is essential. And then also notice 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 7. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 7, where Paul talks about how he has he calls it a thorn in his flesh, some trouble that he would like to be rid of. And he says that he prayed to God 3 times, begging God, please take this thorn out of my flesh. Please take this monkey off of my back. And God's answer was, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. God said, no. Or maybe he was just saying, not yet. I don't know, but sometimes God tells us no. I'm going to leave it on there. Sometimes he just says, not yet. I'll lift it off when the time is right, but it's not going to be today. And he says, just trust that when those burdens that make you feel so weak, make you feel like you can't go on, just trust God. He will lift it off when the time is right. And in the meantime, just keep doing what's right. Just keep doing things God's way. Don't allow Satan to tempt you into thinking you can solve your own problems. Sin is never the answer to our troubles. Only God can truly lift those off in the right way. And if you will trust him like Joseph did, you will more than just exist through that trouble. Remember, Joseph thrived. You can thrive through the most difficult troubles, trusting God will lift it off when the time is right. And if you have a burden that you are struggling to bear, if you have something that's just difficult that's holding on to you, we are here to pray for you and to help you. We want to do whatever we can. And so they ask that you come forward as we stand and as we sing.